Working with an interpreter requires a synergy of skills. Consecutive interpretation requires a level of collaboration that, when overlooked and neglected, may leave the interpreter dumbfounded. Yes, interpreter dumbfoundedness is a thing. That means interpretation is not happening. People working with interpreters need to communicate in its entirety exactly what they intend to say. This takes more than stating specific information. The way the information is delivered matters even more. The interpreter serves as a bridge to enable communication between two parties with limited proficiency in each other's language. The interpreter is not the barrier, nor wants to slow down the pace at which one wants to convey information. Such a perception may betray a lack of understanding of the services of consecutive interpretation. But it should be clear that if one wants to convey information and be understood, the interpreter will facilitate that. Any organization that wants its clients and employees to truly understand each other should consider interpretation services, since that is the core of the interpreter's role. The interpreter is technically blind to how one regards his or her job, but language services will be impacted by how one collaborates with the interpreter. Interpretation services cannot turn an employee's poor service into excellent service, but act as an aid between the parties, especially if the information given to the interpreter is precise and well articulated. That information must also be conveyed so that the interpreter can render it faithfully. This concern must first be that of the employee working with the facilitation of an interpreter before the interpreter comes into play. Indeed, the interpreter needs to hear, understand, and often note down the communicated information. This can all be done at a sensible pace. Those who use interpretation services must be mindful of what the interpreter needs in order to achieve optimal results. Listening to too much information at once is destructive. Let's consider an example. Saying two long statements to the interpreter. While the second statement is being said, the concentration and short-term memory utilized to render the first statement right after it was said will be affected. Notes taken can become partially unintelligible as the expectation of starting to interpret after a workable segment of speech has been captured is violated. This renders the interpretation of the first statement potentially unreliable and the interpretation of the second statement potentially impossible. As a result, to ensure a faithful interpretation, more time will be spent when the interpreter asks for a repetition, starting all over again with the first statement, which could have been interpreted way back already, before the interpreter became dumbfounded. Then time will be needed to interpret the repeated statement. The interpretation time requirement is implied, and out of respect for the person working with the interpreter, it may not be requested explicitly. But frequent requests for repetitions can be expected when clarifications are repeatedly needed or when one does not make timely pauses in one's speech so that the interpretation can take place. An implied collaboration cannot be buried under the idea that one is merely using a service, especially if that is done haphazardly. But with enough regard from each one involved, the interpretation can go forward, understandably, in the most sensible and practical way. A word on best practices. Ideally, the moment for the interpreter to begin his or her rendering is indicated in a speaker's intonation, whether he is speaking or reading a text. Ideally as well, it never needs to get to a point where the interpreter has to ask for a pause in one's speech. This is optimizing one's communication skills. Both the company's representatives and its customers can demonstrate awareness of what is needed to convey information through an interpreter. But it would help if the professionals working with interpreters would recognize how to segment what they are communicating for interpretation purposes, with a full understanding of how consecutive interpretation works. Hence, communication through an interpreter can truly be a seamless and collaborative process. There are exceptions to the ideal scenario, but those will introduce exceptions as well to the interpreter's performance of his duties. For instance, hopefully only for brief moments out of anyone's control, interpretation can take the form of explaining, using the third person, what someone has said. That is an adrenaline-triggered switch, but I digress. Everything about how to best work with an interpreter can be learned and perfected. Working with an interpreter is much more than establishing a connection with one in order to serve a customer, a patient, or anyone a person needs to have an exchange with. It is a job function itself, and problems can arise if it is not recognized as such. Understanding both what the services of an interpreter are and how to use them should be emphasized when an interpreter is retained. This is a responsibility that should be well understood and taken with care. And because demonstrating proficiency in collaborating with an interpreter is quite commendable, workers should be properly compensated for their knowledge and understanding, because knowledge of a subject matter and proficiency in following best practices can be measured and become the basis for recognition or a reward.